This video will offer a brief overview of how to quote from primary and secondary sources. So you should be in the Week 3 module, and you're going to open up the page that says Quoting from Primary and Secondary Sources. And you will see a page that looks like this. This page has a very short version of the information that we're going to go over today. But what you'll need to do is to download this Word document right here that says Quoting from Primary and Secondary Sources. And this file will give you a more extensive set of explanations and examples to refer to when writing your essay. So you're going to open up that, you're going to download and open up that file, and you'll see a page that looks like this. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go over every sentence in this, but I will hit the highlights. So first of all, let's talk about what primary and secondary sources are. So a primary source is just the piece of literature that you're analyzing, and a secondary source is any piece of writing that comments on the primary source. So that's, say, an article on the short story or play or whatever it is. For Essay 1, you are only going to use the primary source, which will be the short story that you choose. For Essay 2, you will quote from both the primary source, which will be the short story, and a secondary source, okay, which is an article on the short story. And I will provide those secondary sources, and I will attach all necessary sources to the exam when you take it. So don't worry about having to memorize anything. So let's discuss how to actually set up direct quotations. Now, I do want to note, as I have up here at the top written, you may only use up to 4 typed lines of quotations. Now, MLA requires you to set quotations off differently once you go over 4 typed lines. So limit to 4 typed lines. So let's jump into how to actually do this. So every direct quotation is going to have 3 parts: the lead-in, the quotation itself, and the citation. The lead-in is the part that sets up your quotation by giving some information about the author, who's speaking, or the circumstances and background on the quote. The quotation itself, that's pretty obvious, right? Those are the actual words from the text, and they are bookended by quotation marks. And the citation gives you some information about where to find the material that you're using. Now, that's always going to include a page number, and sometimes it will include the author's last name and the page number. And we'll talk about what the rules are for the citations here in a minute. So let's start with the lead-in. Now, I want to emphasize that if you just dump your quote down, right, and by that I mean don't use a lead-in, then you're creating a major error in your paper, and there will be deductions for not creating a lead-in for your quotation. Now, there are all kinds of ways that you can create a lead-in for your quote, but the overall point of a lead-in is to let your reader know something about the quote. It's to tell your reader, who's talking, or what's going on, before this quote happens. It's to help situate your reader so that they don't feel kind of lost when they get to your quotation. Remember that even though the quote seems self-explanatory to you, your reader is coming at it fresh. And so you have to kind of gently lead your reader by the hand. So here's some examples. And here's the simplest thing that you can do is just tell me who's speaking and give a verb in the present tense. Now, the examples that I'm using are all from the lottery. So the first 2 are just quotes from the story itself. The last 2 here on the page are quotes from articles on the story. So here's one. Tessie complains. There's Don and Eva. Make them take their chance. Now, you'll notice I told you who's speaking, Tessie. I told you what she's doing with a specific present tense verb, complains. I give you a comma, right? I give you the direct words from the story itself. And then I give you the author's last name and the page number where I found that quote in parentheses at the end with a period afterwards. Okay? So the easiest way for you to set up the lead-in, who's speaking, and a present tense verb and a comma. What you can also do is have a lead-in that is a complete sentence. Okay? Now, sometimes you want to do this because you need to explain the situation or the background, or you are pointing out some particular aspect of what's going on that you think is important and you want to point out the significance of that moment. So here's an example. The narrator reveals the villagers' brutality by pointing to the one unchanged element of the ceremony. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. Jackson 17. So you notice that's a complete sentence, and instead of a comma, I used a colon. Now the reason you need to do that is because if you just have a comma here, then you've put a comma between two complete sentences. That's called a comma splice, and it's considered a major error. If you completely leave off all punctuation, and you just have two sentences connected with nothing, then you've created a run-on or fused sentence, and that's also a major error. So if your lead-in is a complete sentence, you must put a colon here between them. Okay? And of course, because the author's name was not in the lead-in, again, the last name was in the citation. Now you'll notice these last two examples, I'm mentioning the author of the article. And you notice that I'm giving that author's complete name. Now, whenever you introduce a real person into your essay, so the author of a story or the author of an article, you must give that person's complete name the first time that you mention him or her. So, and if the author that you're mentioning is not the author of the story, then you must give some kind of credential. So you'll notice here I've written something like, as literary critic Helen Nebaker explains, or literary scholar A.R. Coulthard believes, etc. I've given some credentials. I've given that person's complete name. After the first mention, you can just refer to that person by last name only. All right, so let's scroll down. Now, another way to do a lead-in is to do what we call an integrated lead-in, and that just means that no punctuation is necessary, okay? In that case, you need to remember that your lead-in cannot be a complete sentence, all right? So if you have a complete sentence, you must have a colon. So if you're doing an integrated lead-in, make sure that the lead-in flows directly into the quote itself, and no pause is necessary or no colon is necessary, okay? So something like, Jackson emphasized that the villagers remembered to use stones. Right? And I have several other examples. Now, if you scroll on down to later in the page, you'll see I have a little box here just with example verbs for the lead-ins. A lot of people like to use a verb like says, and that's fine. However, I suggest that you try and use a specific verb to show that you are, you're evaluating what's going on in the situation. Is that person complaining? Is she asserting something or arguing something, observing something, explaining something? Just try and use a specific verb so that you're pointing out, even in that verb choice, what's happening in that situation. Also, of course, remember present tense. So remember to talk about events in literature as though they are occurring right now. So always use present tense. All right, at this point, we've discussed the lead-in. So let's talk about the quote itself. All right, so back on page 1, you'll notice, all right, when you start your quotation marks, when you start your quotation, you want to begin with an open set of quotation marks. If you have a separated lead-in, by which I mean you have a comma or a colon before your quote, then your quote begins with a capital letter. If, however, you have an integrated lead-in, then you have a lowercase letter here, okay? And we'll talk about what you'll need to do if you have to change that here in just a second. So you'll notice when you write the quote out, you're going to be writing the words exactly as they appear in the source. However, sometimes you are going to need to make changes so that the quote reads correctly in your essay. Sometimes you need to make the quote shorter because it's too long, or sometimes you need to piece together two sentences and the sentences in between aren't really necessary. or sometimes you might need to add a couple of words so that the quote isn't grammatically incorrect. Whatever the situation may be, occasionally you will need to make some small changes. And the main point here is that you have to signal to your reader that you have made those changes. And there are a couple of things that you do in terms of format to tell your readers that you've made those changes. So the first thing that you can do is that you can remove words or sentences, and you can indicate to your reader that you've made those changes by inserting ellipses. And that's this set of 3 periods separated by a space before and after each one. So in this quote, there's Don and Eva. Make them take their chance. So that set of ellipses says, hey, I've taken out some word or set of words from the original source at this point. Okay, so ellipses for when you take things out. The other thing that you can do is you can add to a quote, or you can change the formatting of something. And in that case, you need brackets. So let's scroll down, look at the next page. And the example here is on this quote. Nebuchadnezzar describes Old Man Warner as the prototype of the prophet of doom, a voice of the past, foe of change. So in this case, you'll see the words as the have been added to the quote. Now, you know that they've been added because the brackets are around them. Okay? You can also use brackets if you need to change the capitalization. So if you needed to capitalize a letter or lowercase a letter, then you would put brackets around the letter that you changed. One other thing that you can do, what I have listed here as the special situation, the quotes within a quote, that is when you have somebody else giving a quote within the larger sentence that you are quoting. And so here's how you do that. For the larger quote that you're doing, you set off with double quotes. Okay, so as Old Man Warner observes, used to be a saying about, and here's the quote that Old Man Warner uses, set off with single quote marks. Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. So for quotes within quotes, use single quote marks. All right, so those are the 3 things that you can do. Ellipses for taking things out, brackets for changes or additions, and single quotes for quotes within quotations. All right, so now that we've covered the lead-ins and the quotes themselves, let's discuss the citations. So the rules for citations are pretty straightforward. If your author is mentioned in the lead-in, so for instance, our author here was Shirley Jackson, so Jackson is mentioned in this sentence right here. Jackson emphasizes the fact that the villagers remembered to use stones. Then you only need the page number in the citation. So if the author is in the lead-in, only use the page number. If, however, the author is not in the lead-in, then you must include the author's last name and the page number in the citation at the end. All right, so that's this last example here. And also, I do want to note that the period goes after the citation. Many people want to put the period inside the quotation marks here, but that's not necessary. There's no period before the last set of quotation marks, and there is always a period after the citation itself. Okay, we're going to wrap up the video at this point. Now, I do want to note that if you scroll down, you'll see some instructions on how to set up the works cited page and how to do the entries. You'll see some examples down here, but we're not going to go over all of that in this video because there is a separate video on Canvas to show you how to do all that.